Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Zay. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Port Washington Library. I'm actually also the staff liaison to the library's Nautical Advisory Council, which is the sponsor of tonight's program. I want to begin again by thanking the library's Nautical Advisory Council for generously supporting tonight's program, as well as the refreshments we have available. Part of the mission of the Nautical Council is to support nautically themed programs. And when the library was offered an opportunity to host tonight's program, it was clear that this was a perfect fit for the Nautical Council's mission. I do want to recognize a couple of Nautical Council members who are here, Corey Peterson, Bill Palafox, Mary Lou Dempsey, and Audra Signer, who are here. So a round of applause for them and the Nautical Council. So I believe you're, as I said, all in for a real treat tonight as two presenters from the New Amsterdam History Center will share a dramatic story from our shared history that has been really until recently known only to a handful of historians. You'll shortly be transported back in time to the night of March 8th, 1657, when a nor'easter raged off the coast of Long Island. So joining us tonight to share this story, we are very fortunate to have Toya Dubin and Drew Shuptar-Rayvis, who will offer a richly illustrated presentation, which includes 3D models, historical documents, and interactive maps. So I'll just give you a little bit of background about them. Toya Dubin helped to launch the New Amsterdam History Center's Mapping Early New York, a detailed encyclopedia of Dutch colonial history, linked to 3D models and maps of the Castello Plan, the earliest map of New Amsterdam. Ms. Dubin is president of Hudson Archival, responsible for the digitization of the Dutch documents collection at the New York State Archives. She lives in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by Dutch history. Drew Shuptar-Rayvis, whose traditional name is Pekatawas Makatuweyu, which means black corn. Drew holds a cum laude Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and Sociology from Western Connecticut State University and a certificate degree in Archaeology from Norwalk Community College. He was the first garden manager of Western Connecticut State University's permaculture garden and practices native horticulture. In July of 2021, Drew was appointed by his Paramount Chief, Norris Howard Sr., and Council Member Norris Howard Jr. as Cultural Ambassador of the Pocomoke Indian Nation of Maryland. He is the Algonkian Historical Consultant for the New Amsterdam History Center and is a contractual research and preservation specialist with the Maryland State Archives. His work involves collecting tribal oral histories from Maryland's Eastern Shore to contribute to the MAHC database. So with that being said, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Toya and Drew.
Welcome, everyone. I am Toya Dubin, Director of the New Amsterdam History Center's Mapping Early New York project.
And as you might have figured out, I am Drew Shuptar-Rayvis. I am the Algonkian Historical Consultant for Mapping Early New York. This evening, we will share with you a story about the humanity and complexity of the culture of the indigenous people who live among us today on Long Island. By the end of this evening, you will understand their bravery and compassion and of their ancestors more than 400 years ago, how they managed a humanitarian crisis in a manner that we can all learn from today.
So before we get started, I want to make sure that I thank all of the people who made this possible. The Mapping Early New York project could not be moving forward as it has over the last several years without the incredibly generous support of the Robert David Lyon Gardiner Foundation, the Society of the Daughters of Holland Dames, the First Families of New York, the Netherland America Foundation, Kenneth Chase, the Consul General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and most importantly tonight's performance, the Port Washington Public Library's Nautical Council, along with many private donors. Thank you very much for helping us. Please, when you give, please give generously to all these organizations or any organization who supports work like this. In case you think that Drew and I are the only people involved in this project, we want to tell you that there's a very big creative team involved. And particularly tonight, you're going to see Edward Van Dyke's 3D modeling. You'll see many, many examples of that modeling when you see the Shipwreck. You'll also see maps created by Nitin Gadia, our mapping specialist. Drew has many incredible articles in the encyclopedia that explain Algonkian culture and governance. Esme Berg, our executive director, who makes it all move forward. This is Mustafa Akbey, who worked with me to create the encyclopedia. Jerry O'Toole, who has brought in many, many thousands of documents, and we are happy to announce that we have finally ingested almost all of the New York City Municipal Archives Dutch documents collection as of this week. And Cindy Bogart, who makes it all look beautiful. We also, you'll see Charlie Gearing and Chelsea Teal speak this evening, and we're honored also to have Chief Harry Wallace of the Unkechaug Nation. I want to point out that John Holman and Rick Vanden Heuvel, along with Drew, were the models for a great many of the people in the model that you're going to see, and all three of them are descended from original settlers or original people who were there at the time of this shipwreck, which is pretty wonderful. There's another person I want to be sure to recognize this evening who made it possible for us to have this evening's event, and that is Miss Ina Selden. Without her constant encouragement, we would not be here tonight, so I want to say thank you to her.
A note about the language. In this work, we spent a lot of time reading 17th century primary sources, these documents that use words like Indians or savages rather than Native Americans or indigenous people, and slaves instead of enslaved persons. Please forgive us if we use vocabulary that comes from the documents. We've used multiple terms to cover vocabulary to allow for better search results, as you can see here.
So this is an example of one of a great number of entries from the encyclopedia that you'll be seeing throughout this presentation. And you can see that we've used quite a number of different terms so that people of different ages and with different vocabularies who are searching within the encyclopedia will still get excellent results. These are links that will lead you to our project, including the newamsterdamhistorycenter.org, which is our main site. If you want to reach me directly, info@newamsterdamhistorycenter.org. Please be patient. I will get back to you. It may take a day or so. This is our main website. You can enter the Mapping Early New York project here, and here you can enter its various components if you prefer that way. Here, you can get to the 3D models that are currently on display at the New York Historical Society. I encourage everyone to go see that exhibit. You'll find a kiosk there with a touch screen where you can enjoy our 3D models of New Amsterdam in the year 1660. But for the moment, we're going to go back to our main page and our main project. And I'm going to introduce our guest speakers for the evening. And after that, everything you're going to see will be from our main project.
We are delighted to have Dr. Charles Gearing and Dr. Chelsea Teal of the New Netherland Research Center in Albany join us as speakers this evening. Dr. Gearing is celebrating 50 years of exceptional scholarship in creating the translations of the Dutch documents collection at the New York State Archives. Among his many awards, he has been knighted by the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Sir Charles Gearing's research support of this project has made him our knight in shining scholarship. Dr. Chelsea Teal is a lecturer in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Analysis at Cal Poly Humboldt, in addition to her work at the New Netherland Research Center. Her assistance in all matters weather, geography, and environment has been invaluable. We can't thank both of you enough for all your help in bringing this model to the world. Welcome to Chief Harry Wallace of the Unkechaug Nation in Long Island. Harry B. Wallace served as chief of the Unkechaug Indian Nation on Long Island for 25 years. He's a licensed attorney in New York State and attended Dartmouth College and New York Law School. Since 2016, Mr. Wallace has taught courses at Stony Brook University as part of the Linguistics Department's Algonkian Language Revitalization Project, which he co-founded. And he has been instrumental in helping us with the 3D model and the story of the Prince Maurice. So welcome, and thank you so much for helping us with our work here. Thank you for joining us today, Harry.
He was saying, "Nini na tasulis, turupas mitcha shayon honkachok skiton, medayan and nina chapayo puspatak natap." Greetings, my friends and relatives. My name is Harry Wallace. He was saying, "Nini" in my language, which means hunter man. I'm Turtle Clan, and I'm still the elected chief of the Unkachog Nation, and it's going on 27 years now.
Oh my goodness, wonderful. I'm sorry you got the number wrong there.
Yeah, it's okay. And I'm really glad to be here. And the important thing is that we do our utmost to get history right, because it is important for us to understand not only the events that took place, but also the relationship that took place. And this is, I'm excited about this mapping process that's happening with the New Amsterdam Historical, I guess it's called.
New Amsterdam History Center.
History
It's a
Center.
mouthful.
Right, okay. And they reached out to us, and it is admirable that their effort is to try and get everything as accurate as possible, and not only the events that took place, but the story of the relationship with the original people of this land. So we are here today to try and tell a piece of that story, and to add it to the historic body of work that you're trying to do. Plus, you have a lot of really good, mapping, 3D stuff that I kind of like. I love maps, but I love the 3D maps.
Yeah, it's really fun, and I hope that the people enjoy it, especially your students, which we're very excited that there's the possibility of your students using it.
So everything you're about to see is part of our project, including 3D maps and models. We're hoping we're going to be creating an entirely new way to experience history, where 3D maps, models, and encyclopedia entries allow you to fully research any given subject.
So now, come join us on the Prince Maurice in the dark, the wind, and the cold. On the night of March 8th, 1657, at 10 p.m., the moon went down, and by 11 p.m., the Prince Maurice approached the shore of Fire Island in total darkness, the moon no longer visible.
Jacob Aldrich notes, about 11 o'clock on the night of 8th March, the men unexpectedly called out 8 and 9 fathoms. Wishing thereupon to tack, and the ship refusing, she immediately struck, and so shoved, which she afterwards continued to do harder and harder, so that we were not a moment sure whether we should leave alive or perish. Check out our 3D model of this situation.
The young Unkachog men on lookout duty heard the hull of the ship slam against the sandbar, and the sailors shouting. The waves continued to push the ship all night, and they could hear the masts cracking. At dawn, they would have seen the ship leaning heavily with broken masts, and the people abandoning the ship for the icy beach. Here's Chief Harry Wallace.
Do you think that the lookouts would have heard that ship crash?
No question. They would have known that. They would have known that this wreck had taken place. They would have sent signals out to make sure that everyone was aware of that. They would have known that there were survivors. They would have known the location of the wreck.
Chief Harry Wallace of the Unkachog in a 2023 interview notes, long dugout canoes called mishoons were stationed throughout Fire Island, and Native Americans were posted as lookouts for whales there every day. They probably used whale oil all over their bodies as insulation in winter seas. The people would have been at their height of their whaling skills, so a rescue would not have been too hard to handle. they would have seen the stranded ship in the morning as it disgorged its load of passengers, sailors, armed soldiers, and cargo. They probably sent messages back to their villages to discuss the situation with their council.
Jacob Aldrich writes this about March 8th and 9th. After passing through most of the darkness of that night in the greatest anxiety and fear, we found ourselves at daybreak about a gunshot from the shore. But being between the shoals and the strand in such a bad position and ignorant of whether this place was south or north of the Mannahattas, it was unanimously resolved first to save our lives and then to exert every nerve to save as much as we possibly could. Accordingly, on the 9th of March, in severe, bitter, and freezing weather, with drifting ice after great trouble, through dangerous breakers in a very leaky boat with considerable water in it, we succeeded in reaching the shore on a broken spit of land on which neither bush nor grass grew, nor was any tree or firewood to be found. This is O'Callaghan's translation. Here's Chief Harry explaining how we positioned the wreck and the village in this model.
The work that you did that was so seminal to our being able to understand is based on this map. When you zoom into this very old map, you can see this is Long Island, and the area that we're talking about.
I'm not sure what they said, but it's probably Sakatawaki,
There we go.
land of Sakatawak. Okay, so that's Waki or Aki is a universal term for land.
This is the Carmans River. And we know from Jacob's letters that he says that he's landed somewhere right here, which would be Fire Island. And he says that he's landed somewhere where there's no firewood, no wood of any kind. There's nothing but grass. There's literally nothing. So helped us look at this land here, and we know this break didn't exist at that time. And there are no trees here. This is just all grasses.
So first, let me just explain to you that this is the bridge going to Smith Point Bridge area that you're showing us. And that's good. This is William Floyd Parkway going all the way to Smith Point. And the river that they're referring to is the river where your hand is, which is currently known as Carmen's River. Now, Carmen's was a farmer. The Indian name for that is Connecticut River, which means really long river. Okay, and it flows from fresh water into salt water. But Fire Island, this area in our language was called Sibonak, which means Sibonak is that small tuber-like vegetable that grows from roots. So, it was known for that because that's where we would gather those that food. So if we called it that, as most likely was that there were no trees in that area, but it was bushes and that vegetable that we gathered. There had to be an abundance of that vegetable, otherwise we wouldn't have named it for that vegetable. So when I was advised that the river was called the Connecticut River, my first instinct was that the same name was given to a river that's closer to Islip. It's the same name, Connecticut, which is where the Fire Island seashore area is further west in the Great South Bay area, which to me, it carries the same name. But when you advised me that the first-hand accounts indicated that there were no firewood, to me that made no sense, because this whole area, even today, contains one of the oldest wilderness areas still in existence in the United States. And that is the Pine Barrens Forest on Fire Island. Today it exists over 7,000 acres of natural woodland. See it on this map.
Yeah, this is completely covered in trees. Jacob Aldrich's description that there's no trees, there's no firewood, there's nothing here but grass and sand. This doesn't seem like a good choice.
And it was most likely more than 7,000 acres at the time of his.
Right.
So it made no sense that that river was the location which history records, because it says next to the Connecticut River, or Connecticut River, which the historians did not acknowledge that the same name for that river was here, right by India, in what's called Fireplace Neck, or Bellport Bay, for that matter. This is what they call it today, this area. But it is, that river is the same river. And
so Jacob's letters say that he finds himself at the mouth of a river at a place called Sikdawak. Mm-hmm. And based on your review of this map and that description, we ended up placing this village near Squassocks Landing.
Probably just west of Squassocks.
Right about here.
Somewhere in that area, which would be today's modern day Brookhaven or East Bellport.
Now, we don't know whether or not that's right. It's an educated guess this time. And if we get very lucky and find that there's archaeological evidence there and we get proved right, that'll be very exciting.
So here is the 3D model again for you. Were the Europeans blinded by the icy landscape of a snowy beach as they came up from the hull after a night of rocking in that creaking, broken ship? Surely many of them felt ill and terrified as they landed somewhere very far from their imagined Eden. And we're going to talk to you for a moment. I'm going to run this one more time so that you can see the shack one more time. So we had this idea, how would you handle providing some shelter for your people if you find yourself shipwrecked with a whole hold full of barrels of all kinds of sizes and all kinds of other goods? And so we initially imagined, you'd build a shack out of that and you would cover that with a sailcloth. And then I began doing more research and found that actually Jacob Aldrich and his crew knew exactly how to do that, because when they got down to the Delaware, they found that they didn't have a warehouse for the goods, and they built exactly that, a shack out of all of those materials and covered it with old sailcloth. So that is what we've done here. And we want to talk with you a little bit about the use of AI in this project. Here we have Captain Martin Krieger of the Dutch West India Company soldiers, and Alexander de Hinojosa, who was the lieutenant of the Dutch West India Company of soldiers, and Jacob Aldrich, who was the appointed director of the South River settlement. This is actually Rick Vanden Heuvel, who very kindly is a very skilled reenactor and dressed for us. This is John Holman, and we used AI to generate Alexander de Hinojosa's face, assuming approximately a 25-year-old man who might have been a little bit darker. And this is, of course, John Holman dressed as Jacob Aldrich. The Native Americans, almost all of them are wonderful Drew Shuptar-Rayvis, dressed in a variety of different clothing. And then we used Photoshop to change the colors, add various other accoutrements to the particular outfit. And we used AI to generate a multiplicity of Native American faces. So that was how we managed to begin populating a village when you get to the Unkachaug village of so many people, when we only have a few models to work with at the moment. But we also, we have here a shack that all these people are in the cold, and you'll notice there's no fire, and there's a reason why.
So one of the things that when we were looking at the documents and reading the material, One of the things that the soldiers bring with them, as you can imagine, are firearms and gunpowder, which is what you need to make the firearms work. Gunpowder is comprised of 3 different chemicals: charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur. All of those things have to be ground very finely and very carefully because they're incredibly explosive. So when you're storing gunpowder, typically it was done in barrels. Some of you might remember nail barrels. That's kind of the size of what a gunpowder barrel would look like. And typically you want to keep that in a barrel and possibly in a cloth bag that's maybe waxed, because gunpowder has a couple problems with it. One, it's very, very receptive to moisture. So if gunpowder gets wet or gets moist, it becomes inert, which means that it either will turn to mush and won't work, or even if you're able to dry it out, when you go to spark it or you go to use it, it'll be very inconsistent with how it works. Also, gunpowder, as one can imagine, is incredibly sensitive to heat. Obviously, open flame, not a great idea with an explosive, but also even hot air or hot metal can spark gunpowder and cause it to explode. So it's one of those things that when we were thinking about this, it was important for us not to have a fire in this building, because they would have known that. They would have known that this gunpowder was way too precious for them to lose and was far too easy if they built a fire for them to lose.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, he says they have no fire, which I don't know whether that means that they made that very smart
They
decision.
might have not been able to do it.
And they might not have been able to do it. Everything just might have been too wet. So, March 10th, 1657. For the crew and passengers of the Prince Maurice, another day and night without fire, on the beach, in wet clothing, in seriously cold weather. After months in the dark hold of a leaky ship, their clothing is always wet, and now it is stiff with cold. With no fire, the ship's cook can only give them cold rations. Here's Charlie Gearing.
We're talking about what the menu on board this ship might have been, especially since they were all the way at the end of their journey, right? So they probably didn't have a whole lot of fresh food left in the hold by the time they reached Fire Island. So what we imagine they likely had was hardtack and salt pork to eat. So tell us a little bit about hardtack.
Well, hardtack is basically what it says. It's like a zwieback, baked twice and hardened so that it lasts forever, it seems. Very difficult to chew.
Well, wouldn't they soak it? I think you soak hardtack before you eat
Well,
it.
you have to,
Yeah.
you'd have to, yeah.
They put it in stew and...
But eating it with salt pork, I think those were the 2 things that they managed to capture aboard the ship and take ashore, with salt pork and hardtack. So they had that to eat for a period of time.
Sure.
And it could be very distressing if you had scurvy. Scurvy attacks your gums and loosens your teeth up, and it would have been a bit of a problem even consuming what had survived.
Especially in those first couple of days when they landed on Fire Island and they had no fire. So I think that means you're taking hardtack and soaking it in whatever water is left in your water barrels and slicing off bits of this cold salt pork, and that's what people are eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They may very well have had limoensap, is what they call it, lemon juice in barrels. The Dutch were aware of the use of citrus to prevent scurvy. So they may very well have had that with them. But you see it being sent up from Curacao up to New Netherlands, barrels of limoensap.
And the world's oldest piece of hardtack is on display.
Oh, really?
Yes, it has a whole display and a protective case, and it's just this little piece of hardtack.
March 10th, 1657. For the Native Americans, the council may have decided to assist, but given the fact that 80 armed soldiers were part of the group, they may have sent word to surrounding villages asking for additional men to come to the village to ensure a sufficient display of force to avoid conflict. Those warriors would have arrived later that day or the next, and the village was made ready to assist. Chief Harry Wallace, interview 2023. Let us remove ourselves from the wretched scene of freezing Europeans on the brink of death and the Unkachog, Shinnecock, and Secotog people in deliberation at their councils on the Carmens River, and go back in time to the departure of the Prince Maurice from Amsterdam.
It is December 21st of 1656. The weather is very cold, and the canals are frozen in Amsterdam. The Little Ice Age has made winters there cold enough for skating on the canals to become a favorite social gathering.
Jacob Ulrichs, the newly appointed director of New Amstel at the Delaware River, is traveling with his wife. They had no children, and a large group of people have gathered on the docks to begin their adventure to the New World. Alexander de Hinojosa, his 25-year-old lieutenant, and Captain Martin Krieger, a 40-year-old veteran, are both gathering the soldiers and military equipment.
Perhaps the general public isn't aware of how mobile people were in the 17th century.
There are some people in New Netherlands who went back and forth 5 or 6 times. We shudder at the thought of going once in one of these ships, spending 2 months aboard a cramped ship in horrible weather, and they didn't think twice about it. If they had to go back to Europe to settle some problems with their property over there, they got on a ship and went back, and it was a year later they were back in New Netherlands again. And it was just a different, that's the way life was back then. No internet and no air travel.
Yes, and I think I will never complain about an airline seat again.
Right.
Right?
They will first sail to Texel, an island off the coast of Holland, where the fleet will gather. Here you can imagine the chaos of many ships loading, seagulls screeching, sailors swearing over heavy loads or playing songs on mouth harps, soldiers carrying clanking swords, wheelbarrows rolling on wooden gunwales, dogs barking, sails and flags flapping, and hawkers selling anything that can be needed for the coming journey.
Charlie, would you like to tell us a little bit about why on earth was the city of Amsterdam involved in sending a ship to the South River for a Delaware colony?
Good question. It's a bit of a long story, but I'll compress it as well as I can. The Dutch had control of New Netherlands from approximately Cape Cod all the way to Delaware Bay. This is what they assumed was under their control as appeared from the movements of Henry Hudson in 1609, going into Delaware Bay and then eventually up the coast and along Cape Cod and back to the Netherlands. That was in 1609. 1638, the Swedes decide to start a colony in the Delaware area. They knew that the Dutch were fairly weak in that part of New Netherlands, which they called the South River, and they sent over Peter Minuit or Minuet as the director of a colony to trade with the Indians, specifically for furs and any other valuable resources. The Dutch were very upset that they were intruding and encroaching on their territory, but they didn't have the means to do much about it at that time. This was during the period of Willem Kieft, the director preceding Peter Petrus Stuyvesant. When Petrus Stuyvesant becomes director, he takes a more aggressive approach to recovering property that he felt belonged to the West India Company. And the directors encouraged him to take over New Sweden, as the Dutch colony on the South River was called. It was basically centered on what is now Wilmington, Delaware, and then up as far as what is now Philadelphia. Stuyvesant is loaned a large warship, 42-gun ship called the Waag, the Scales, to help him with his invasion of New Sweden. He comes into Delaware Bay with the Waag and about 7 other smaller ships and 300 and some soldiers, 325 or so soldiers. They managed to take over New Sweden practically without firing a shot. And the city of Amsterdam's ship, the Waag, was a very imposing sight in the South River, as you can imagine, and the Swedes saw immediately that they were in an untenable situation. So it was basically the city of Amsterdam that had sort of provided the means of taking over this encroachment on their property without any loss to them. Of course, the mayors of Amsterdam are in many cases involved in the West India Company as well, in the Kamer van Amsterdam, as it's called, the Chamber of Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. They have the controlling interest in the colony of New Netherland. They decide that as payment for their warship, they would like to open their own colony on the South River and do what the Swedes were doing and develop a financial interests in the fur trade and possibly the tobacco trade and so forth. So the deal is made in 1657 that a major part of the South River would be ceded, or not ceded, but deeded over to the city of Amsterdam. They put together a fleet of ships, De Bear, De Bever, mm-hmm. and the Prince Maurice, of course, and Gelderse Blom. The Prince Maurice was the biggest, or the largest, I would say, of the 4 ships. And this is where the story begins. Jacob Ulrichs is in command of the venture, and they leave in December. What is the date? The 28th?
Yeah, December the 19th, they depart from Amsterdam, and then they depart from Texel on Christmas Day.
On Christmas Day, yeah, I knew
Christmas Day.
A significant day, and they proceed to head west to take possession of this land that is basically repayment for the Waag, for the ship that they had loaned to the West India Company.
So December 25th, 1656 is when they departed from Texel. And I'm going to show you this map from our mapping project. There's a zoom to button here that'll allow you to get right to it, which is very nice. And you'll take a look at this map, which they most likely were carrying because it was published in 1651, 1654, 1656, and many, many other publications after that. It's missing something very important here when you see Long Island, which is Fire Island, of course. So, Jacob might have believed that Providence was watching over this expedition, especially because he left on Christmas Day. Perhaps it's because of this that he put aside his worries about leaving on a voyage he described in his own letters to Amsterdam, where, quote, neither the skipper, pilot, nor any superior office belonging to the ship had ever been in New Netherland or frequented its coast. So you have to imagine that a group of sailors using this map and approaching at night would have potentially slammed right into Fire Island.
So imagine that you were traveling with your family to the promised Eden of a new world, and you were leaving the world's most luxurious city, Amsterdam. Great art was being made there. All the world's most expensive goods were being traded there. Books and printing were thriving. And if you were from one of the most successful families, you were probably living a very extravagant life. But there was a dark side to this also. Because of wars and natural disasters in Europe, there are a great many poor people trying to find a living in Amsterdam. There are so many orphans that the city of Amsterdam is shipping some of them to the settlement in New Amsterdam. And the demeaning use of African slaves dressed as elegant pages to mark the status of wealthy households was commonly recorded in paintings of this era. Because of religious tolerance and massive worldwide trade in goods, many languages and cultures mix on the streets. You can hear Jewish and Arabic languages, smell the spices of India, Asia, and the pepper of Madagascar. The Dutch could buy furs and feathers from all over the world. The canals smell of animal and human waste. There are people hawking pickled fish in barrels, squawking parrots and monkeys on chains. Adrian van der Donk notes that beaver oil from New Netherlands is sold in Amsterdam, and it can be rubbed on the temple of crazy people to make them sleep.
The Prince Maurice was probably 95 to 110 feet long. You can imagine that as sort of 6 or 7 minivans long, with a huge cargo hold. Crew, passengers, and soldiers would all have had to sleep in hammocks, probably on the first level under the deck. There were probably 2 more levels below that. This is a schema for hanging hammocks in a ship very similar to that. You can imagine how crowded it was and how well everyone got to know one another.
Martin Krieger, barking orders at 80 Dutch West India Company soldiers, was supervising the loading of guns, armor, barrels of gunpowder, and the Spanish wine that would make the journey tolerable. Manifests also show that the ship was carrying duffel cloth of great value to the indigenous people: linen, stone, tiles, lime, and coals. All the ships include immigrants to New Amstel, but the Prince Maurice has the majority of the passengers, with 123 to 129 souls on board, including a ship's cat.
But let's talk about duffel cloth before we talk about the ship's cat.
Sure. So duffel cloth is a thick, coarse, woven woolen cloth. It's one of these earliest trade goods that we have. Some of our earliest documents go around to the early 1620s, mid-1620s. Duffel cloth is sometimes known as Fries or Dutch Welsh rugged cloth, and it came in a variety of colors. The most predominant were red and blue, and it was highly desirable not only for color, but it's fire retardant, meaning that it won't burn, but also that it will insulate you even when the fabric is wet, which is important for people who live on the coast and on waterways.
Yeah, it was the polar tech of its day. It was really awesome stuff as far as everyone was concerned.
Right.
You probably have heard of duffel coats, that it's similar to that. So let's learn about a ship's cat.
So Charlie and Chelsea, I didn't realize that there is such a thing as a ship's cat, but you filled me in on this. And you can just see in the snow, here's this cat.
Yeah, well, every ship had a cat, and it guarded the edible material in the hold from rodents. Rodents inevitably would get aboard the ship, climbing up the ropes and so forth. And in fact, they used to put discs on the rope so the rats couldn't get over top of them and get into the ship. And the cat's job was to patrol the hold and sleep in the various areas where edible material was. And they protected, it was a job. and they were part of the crew. This tradition carries on with the navies of today. They'll always have a cat aboard their ship.
I actually did some reading after you suggested this, and I'm going to put our screen back on, and found that there's records of ship's cats going all the way back to the Viking Age, which is amazing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And Chelsea very intelligently placed the cat. We had this big debate. Would they save the cat, right?
Oh, well, I would imagine you get bonded to it. It's just a little furry animal. Someone would have tucked it under their arm.
Is in the shack, doing what cats do, prevent you from writing your letters. Let's talk about what happens 3 days after they leave on the 28th of December. They hit a storm. And you helped us research that, Charlie. What happened was a very important beam broke that supports this mainmast. Do you want to talk to us about that a little bit?
Right. They not only were they separated from one another, the Prince Maurice that carried Ulrichs, the Hinojosa, and Martin Krieger were left alone in the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. The other three ships went on, but in this storm, a beam that runs laterally across the ship that supports the main mast was cracked. Ulrich describes it as a large crack, and this would have made the main mast and sail structure unstable. It would have caused the ship to be off balance, mm-hmm. and very difficult to handle. In fact, in one document, Ulrich mentions that it's not a good sailor.
Yes.
And I imagine, I don't know whether it was before the crack of the Visser beam. In Dutch, it's called the Visser, the Visserbalk, that supports the main mast. But it may very well have been a problem in heavy seas, and especially when it reaches the coast of North America.
Chelsea, now that we know that the ship is going to take the southerly course because, quote, she's a poor sailor, I thought we would talk a little bit about what that course looks like.
Yeah, so really what you're looking at is the northeast trade winds in yellow, and then the prevailing westerly winds in the mid-latitudes, which is blue. And so if you want to take the path of least resistance that is most predictable, that people have been using for a long time, you would go that way, which is why Columbus ended up in the Caribbean, because the yellow northeastern trade winds would have dumped him right there unless he navigated his way out of it. So the boat ended up passing the usual islands like Canary Islands, Madeira, Azores. That's why those island names come up a lot. They're right on the way as convenient stopovers. And then head out over the open ocean, and then they would have curved up the east coast of North America. And they do report passing along what we call South Carolina now. And then that's when they're starting to pick up the westerly winds. But at the same time, the winds are blowing in this clockwise direction. They're creating surface currents that are also going in that direction. So they're having aid from below and from above. And because none of them had come to North America before, unfamiliar with the coastline, they went right past their destination and ended up off the coast of Long Island.
February 17th, 1657. Everyone has been on the ship now for almost 2 months in the dead of winter, crossing the Atlantic. Were they able to resupply their water and food with indigenous people near South Carolina? Training could have taken place via Missoons for fresh venison, duck, geese, and perhaps some dried corn. The moon was in waxing crescent on February 17th when they arrived at Cape Romaine, and by the 28th it would be full. Navigating at night would have been a bit easier by then, and perhaps they departed this coast on the 25th so that the full moon would be helpful.
March 11th, 1657. So now we return to Fire Island and the Prince Maurice, which hit the sand on the night of March 8th, 1657. The valuable cargo from the ship has been brought to the beach to create a shelter for 129 souls packed in there with no fire. People are really hungry, thirsty, and very cold by now.
A delegation of Indigenous warriors comes to the beach to offer their help. Their council meetings have determined that this is a rescue, and therefore their laws state that they must offer humanitarian assistance. The debate may have been quite fierce. The 1655 Peach War was so recent in memory, a memory filled with violence and murder, and the encroachment of European settlements nearby was becoming problematic. Here's Harry Wallace talking about the debate.
But you can imagine, because we participated, we, the Onkachog and the native people of Long Island participated in that war. So you could understand the reticence they would have
Yes.
in communicating with a beached ship with maybe, what, a couple of hundred people?
Once you determined that it was indeed a rescue, that's a different thing, right?
That's something different. Once they're in distress and they've expressed the need for assistance, then the decision would have been made to help people. And that would have been, and we would have had the wherewithal and to be able to accommodate what their needs were.
If someone expresses the need for rescue and help, the response is essentially part of the culture, part of the law.
Well, it's the nature of the law here. And even Brander Donk, who made that map that you displayed earlier, understood the control that the way we lived our life was the law of nature and the law of nations, which represents to us that the dish with one spoon that says if you come in peace, you're entitled to share in the resources and in those things that we have for your personal needs, so long as you come in peace. So that is the law of the land. That would have been the law of the land, and it remains the law of the land as far as we're concerned. So they would have been, the native people would have been governed by that understanding of what the law was. And so they would have accommodated, they would have assisted in rescuing these folks.
The easiest course of action would have been to allow the people of the Prince Maurice to freeze and starve to death, then gather the spoils from the beach. But others would have argued that assisting now might result in a friendly trading relationship in the future, and that it was both custom and law that there is a duty to provide the assistance necessary for people to survive an emergency. Once the lookout's description of women and children disembarking along with the soldiers was heard by the council, all thoughts of military conflict dissolved. Still others might have argued that the people of the Prince Maurice might survive and decide to settle right there on Onkachog lands. Thus, helping them to move along elsewhere was the best course of action. The council was made up of the sachem, sagamore, or vice chief, council of elders, and young warriors. Their final decision was to follow the humanitarian laws, but to ask surrounding villages to provide additional men to ensure that the Europeans would be significantly outnumbered. They agree to bring the people and the goods to their village to the Carmen's River. Many Mishuns and men arrive to work with soldiers, sailors, and passengers to transfer the goods and get everyone to the village. This effort would have taken the entire day of March 11th. There are probably almost 200 people working, and as many as 50 Mishuns, some large enough for whaling.
Mishun in our word means to go by water, what it means. So Mishunam is he who goes by water, or one who goes by water. So that is what the name, and it's related to a canoe. Now these are canoes that are not what you would find in your typical Hollywood movie. These are canoes that were designed to navigate oceans and seas and bays. And these canoes were basically dug out from large trees that were part of the Long Island environment. It would have been the big tulip poplar trees or the large oaks. And some of these trees back then were so big that when you dug them out to make them, the rowers could sit side by side. So they were not just one man, in front or back. So they would have been like anywhere from 20 to 40 feet long. There would have been 20, 30 men who would have operated these canoes, and they would have been, because they were used to not only to navigate the waters, but also for fishing, for whaling. In Massachusetts, they actually found in pitch pine, which is where they were stored for preservation purposes, they actually found a 40-foot dugout canoe, still relatively good preserved condition. And they show how big and how it was thick on the base, and then it became very thin along the sides as a form of navigation.
Sure.
It was a brilliant design.
In the case of the Prince Maurice, they're transporting people and things to the village. It's reasonable to assume that it would have been possible to put quite a number of people into one of these machine, right?
Without a doubt, it would have been easy to place those supplies in a boat of this type and make the navigation across the bay into the village. And those canoes would have been placed strategically along the island in order to accommodate a quick move to capture a whale.
March 12th, 1657. Jacob's letter says that they are at Siktawak or Sikawak. By the time he was writing on March 12th, 129 people had suffered in the cold for 4 days and nights without fire and traveled in Mishuns to the Unkachag village.
What did it feel like for the passengers of the Prince Maurice, who thought they were headed for a new Eden, to walk into this Long Island Algonkian village with its wooden palisades and long houses covered with bark, large dogs that looked like wolves and small, almost fox-like dogs, men with partially shaved heads and feather decorations, women wearing heavy furs, children everywhere, the smell of fires from every wigwam, cooking pots of sapan and fish stew, and the soft footfalls of winter moccasins. The warmth of the longhouse must have been heavenly after 3 days without fire.
So you're going to see as we enter this longhouse, there's a fire. The sides of the longhouse are made of bark. And inside, we have Jacob Aldrich and Captain Martin Krieger engaging in trade and discussion with the chiefs at the village. And one of the chiefs is holding up, or an orator, we don't know, is holding up a white wampum. Let's hear Chief Harry on that subject.
In this image, we see one of the chiefs holding a white wampum belt. You want to talk with us about that?
Well, of course, white and wampum is the beads that come from the Quahog shell and from the Matahoa shell, which is the whelk shell. And it is, white is the symbol for peace. And people, my students will tell you that it is used when to represent friendship, alliances, and peace. So to hold up a belt of wampum is a reflection of a message of peace and friendship that's being offered there at that time. So your symbolism is reflecting that the people who were there would have been peaceful at the time.
This is where Jacob Aldrich wrote his letter. It was carried by two Indigenous people down to Manhattan. We don't know who those people were, sadly. I would love to be able to give them names and learn about who they were and what their story is. And one of the things that I found very fascinating about your discussion about Mishuns and the culture of Mishuns is how incredibly mobile the society was. That it just wouldn't have been a big deal for them to say, okay, I'm headed down to Manhattan with this letter.
Well, all the roads that exist today were I won't say all the roads. I say the major roads that exist on Long Island today, they're all original native trails.
Mm-hmm.
So those trails would have been effective in the movement, heading either east or west or north or south. And the rivers themselves are highways. So if you need to navigate distances, the rivers was the original interstate. The artifact history will tell you that there are so many different items that come from places where there never was anything of that nature available naturally in this area. So it's obviously a form of trade. And Manhattan was always, the island of Manhattan has always been considered a place where people from the north, the south, and the west would have come to trade. And in that sense, it is no different than what it is today.
Once they arrived in New Amsterdam, perhaps they met with other Indian traders in front of Sarah Kierstead's house near the docks, and thus were directed to Petra Stuyvesant's quickly. March 16th, 17th, 18th. Petra Stuyvesant and several small ships traveled up to the Carmens River to begin the rescue operation. Perhaps on the 17th, loading, and Petrus departing on the 18th, others departing on the 20th.
March 20th, 1657, Jacob Ulrich sends an additional letter from the Carmens River via Ensign Peter Smith, who left here in the company's yacht, Dondracht. It seems that he sent people and cargo down to Manhattan in that yacht with goods to be stored in the company warehouse, and he's hoping that the ships return as quickly as possible. It's now 12 days since the shipwreck, and most of the people remain at the Carmens River on Unkachag ancestral lands. 80 Dutch soldiers with armaments and copious wine barrels have been living with the Unkachag, and there is no mention of any trouble. Martin Krieger and Alexander de Hinojosa have managed to keep their men under control. The chiefs and council must also have kept good control of the village, and certainly the Spanish wine in the cargo must have been kept tightly closed.
For the indigenous calendar, March is a time of year when food stores are running low, and planting has not yet begun. How did a village that normally supported 150 people take in 129 rescues and the estimated 100 additional warriors from surrounding villages for weeks? The hold of the Prince Maurice would have had barrels of salt pork, hardtack, and other food supplies for passengers and crew, but these would have been running quite low at the end of their journey. We know that the abundance of the shellfish in the bay provided food year-round. Venison, ducks, and other prey were available to indigenous hunters. They lived in a world of plenty, but even that would have been strained by so many guests and the time of year. Trading with the Dutch for duffel and other goods would have encouraged hunters from nearby villages, bringing more food also. Perhaps the meals at the village were a combination of indigenous and ship's cooked dishes. Sapan, a cornmeal mush, pounded walnuts and hickory nuts made into nut milk, pounded dry fish, dried meats and dried berries, Indian corn cakes, which are very dense and calorie-rich. Hominy, as well as hominy, was also a common dish that was shared. Europeans may have even had some signs of scurvy after so long at sea. The berries, dried vegetables, and herbal teas would have seemed like luxury. The salt pork and hardtack might have been added to stews and shared with the Indians so that an exchange of flavors and ideas began.
March 22nd, 1657. Now we are 2 weeks since the shipwreck and a full week living in the Unkachag village. Jacob writes again to Petra Stuyvesant. He notes that he has been able to send down another load of cargo in the Dundrocht, but again asks for additional ships to help transport people and the rest of the cargo down to Manhattan. He is prioritizing sending people down to Manhattan, probably to lessen the load on the village and keep things peaceful.
March 22nd to April 12th. So by now, the shipping in the Dundrocht is much faster, 1 to 2 days in each direction. Perhaps because it is relatively small and winds are favorable, moving people out of the village will help to ease food demands. Fishing and whaling season may have begun by now, and men helping out at this village will be missed by their home villages. Everyone is motivated to help load the ships and help the Europeans on their way.
April 13th, 1657. Jacob writes from Fort Amsterdam to the commissioners at Amsterdam. He and his wife are staying at Stuyvesant's house, and it must have seemed a palace to them after their time in the ship and the shacks. We can imagine that a hot bath might have been prepared for them. Their clothes would have been cleaned and mended. They could sit next to a hearth and warm their feet. Perhaps they had coleslaw, cider, and beer for the first time in many weeks. They probably attended a church service and met most of the settlement there. Jacob's letter has detailed requests to help establish the colony in South River and another account of the wreck. This is his most detailed description of the situation to date. He notes that 9 smaller ships, yachts, and schooners were required to bring goods and passengers to Manhattan. He also describes what happened to the ship itself. Quote, "Working with great labor and industry, I have discharged most all of the goods as far as it was possible, but before they could all be got out, the ship stove into 1,000 splinters and pieces. But to transport the woodwork from above named place hither is not worth the freight and expense. Besides, the stone, tiles, lime, coals, etc. are lost and washed away." So this is a really interesting description given the size of the Prince Maurice and the tremendous weight of stone, roof tiles, and barrels of lime. The cracking open and splintering of the hull was certainly possible. But all that, especially since the visor beam was cracked, but all that weight would have been hard to wash away. Was the carcass of the ship left there? It could provide lumber and metal fittings if harvested properly. The English settlers nearby may have done this. Jacob Aldrich finds himself in need of roof tiles, stone, and lime when he arrives at New Amstel's Fort Casimir, so they definitely did have a value. Additionally, there's no record of Stuyvesant organizing a crew to retrieve this part of the cargo. Perhaps it's still there, buried in the sand, like this shipwreck of a Dutch East India Company ship. Who knows? Be really fun to try to find out.
The Bever set sail from New Amsterdam on April 16th of 1657 to the South River, arriving at New Amstel on April 25th, with about 125 persons from the colony from the ship Prince Maurice, Jacob Ulrichs. 38 soldiers with Captain Martin Krieger of New Amsterdam and Lieutenant Alexander de Hinojosa marched overland because there was no room in the Bever to allow of their coming by water. The soldiers on that account therefore arrived at the fort 6 days later than me.
April 25th, 1657. The colonists did not arrive in their new home on the South River until almost 9 weeks since their shipwreck and 4 months since their hopeful departure on Christmas Day in Texel.
Approximately May 1st, 1657. Those 38 men marching with Martin Krieger didn't arrive until May 1st and would have walked approximately 137 miles for perhaps 7 to 10 days in all kinds of weather to meet their friends and families. They would have passed through the lands of many tribal communities. They might have taken an interpreter, a boschlapper, and an Indian guide. We don't know. Similar to Henry Norwood's experience 6 years earlier, who was stranded on Assateague Island and traveled to Jamestown, Virginia, with an Indian trader named Jenkins Price and his Indian interpreter, a man named Jack. This trip was approximately 137 miles, 20 miles per day, fully loaded. We estimated around 7 to 10 days for weather and river crossings.
May 8th, 1657. Jacob Aldrich writes to Petrus Stuyvesant, thanking him for the rescue, the help in New Amsterdam, and news of the new settlement. My lord, I herewith earnestly and dutifully thank you from the bottom of my heart for the good treatment and friendship which I received and enjoyed at your house and elsewhere.
We don't know if the Unkachog people and their sister communities were thanked by the Europeans. We do know that if it was not for their speedy decision of their council, which usually took many days or weeks to make decisions, there is very little chance Jacob would have survived to write that letter, or that any of the passengers and crew would have survived. Because of this humanitarian decision, descendants of both the Europeans and the Unkachog survive today to commemorate this event. To Europeans, the governments of the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands appeared drastically foreign and ineffectual, but these bodies were as complex and hierarchical as Europe's by no means primitive or savage, as later authors implied. European societies were largely built upon the structure of the divine right of monarchy. Whether nobles, military officers, magistrates, director generals, and even to a degree owners of property or companies, each level of authority was, within its domain, considered to be a representative of the crown, backed accordingly with its nearly absolute power. A European official could, generally, issue immediate and absolute decisions within his purview, and those orders were often executed without question. Europeans, therefore, were used to a certain level of expediency in law, trial, and decision-making. Often, what Europeans perceived and described as ineffectual was the difference in direct command structures, frequent and cumbersome debates among large councils in which many had the unequivocal right to speak, and the lengthy, albeit relaxed, manner in which justice was served as compared to their own experience of government. However, after a few generations of exposure to the decentralized power structures of a more democratic method, the descendants of those original scandalized Europeans who encountered Algonkian people's radically different form of government during the 17th century combined elements of Eastern woodland governance with the classical patterns of Greece and Rome to create the unique blend of representational democracy in the United States Constitution.
Clearly, in the case of the wreck of the Prince Maurice, this process resulted in a humanitarian effort on the part of the Algonkians that required a significant investment of manpower, resources, and time. May it stand as an example to all of us 400 years on. Thank you.
So thank you guys so much. We really appreciate the deep dive into 1657 and 17th century history. We'll definitely have take some time for questions now. I do want to again thank our Nautical Advisory Council for sponsoring the event, and of course the New Amsterdam History Center, Toya, Drew, Ina, your board. We thank you so much for bringing this presentation to us. So if folks have questions, you can just raise your hand, and we got a couple here. I'll come right back to you. I saw this one.
You had two different cultures, and they met. How did they communicate without, the language of each?
That's a very good question. So one of the things that we know through primary sources is there's a lot of sign language going on. So we mentioned Henry Norwood's account. Henry Norwood was stranded in 1649 on Assateague. He was stranded. My community, the Pocomoke Indian Nation, our paramountcy helped him, and other communities helped him as well. And so one of the things that Norwood describes is that the Indians tried talking to him, but they talked to him in signs. They used their hands showing where the sun is, moving their hands back and forth, telling him, we're going to be back when the sun is here. and moving their hands back and forth, showing the placement of the sun. And Norwood kind of figured out what they were talking about with hand signs. We do know that for Norwood's case is that they did use a trade jargon with Norwood. They tried speaking to him in the Lenape dialect of the Algonkian language, which was one of the predominant dialects of coastal Virginia. He obviously didn't really understand, but he knew words because he had read a few books. And so when they said things like Wirrawance, which is a clan chief, or sometimes it can be a paramount chief, he understood who he was going to meet, or he understood certain different things. So we know oftentimes there's a lot of hand signing that's described. Occasionally some of these Dutchmen do know words, or they have individuals that know a handful of words. And sometimes some of the native people know bits of European languages. So with Jenkins Price, Norwood writes about Jenkins Price is that, and this is his words exactly, that he speaks broken Indian was Norwood's use of phrase. Enough that he could ask Jack to do things, pick up this barrel, move this over here, I want that cloth, not this cloth. Maybe not talk to him about the complexities of clanship and matrilineal kinship, but enough that they could converse and do things, and he could ask questions and get answers. So we do know that there are people who have command of some language, but a lot of times it's a lot of signing we read about.
Yeah, and also this community, the Unkachau community, was clearly involved in trade at Manhattan. So that means that they had some members of their tribe who were headed down to Manhattan pretty frequently. They took part in the Peach War. They knew that trade route, right? And there was a huge amount of Machoon traffic headed for the docks in Manhattan daily. Sarah Kierstead's house, which you saw our encyclopedia entry on it, was eventually by 1662 they had built an Indian trading house so that the Native Americans coming there could spend the night if they needed to, or stockpile goods or whatever. So because Long Island is so close to Manhattan, there was probably a lot more communication possible with this particular group than Norwood may have experienced in Virginia.
Right. And what is now Maryland as well.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
I have so many questions.
Good.
This was really fascinating. But my one question is, I use the Wallachia Project a lot. Do you use that at all?
Oh, indeed. The Wallachia Project and Eric Sanderson's amazing map of Mannahatta is in fact part of our project thanks to his generosity.
Yeah.
It's one of the layers of maps that you can choose on our mapping page.
Oh, great. And then my other, I could be here all night. Are Jacob Aldrich's letters readable online?
In our project, yes.
Hot dog, thanks.
Sure.
I have a question for you, in particular, Toya. You talked a little bit at the beginning about, and you obviously demonstrated in a number of cases these 3D models.
Yes.
And perhaps that being something as a new horizon with researching history and describing and explaining history. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how this new technology, you even mentioned AI, how is those technologies transforming history?
Thank you. Yes. I want to be very clear. This is an interpretation, right? Everyone interprets history to the best of their ability. One of the great things about the digital world is if you make a mistake or a blooper, you can fix it and change it, right? But our idea is that people want to be able to do as much or as little of a deep dive into a situation as their interests allow. And that because we're a visual culture, being able to see visualizations of a particular era in history are important. But it's also really important that you don't make a 3D model that isn't based on as much factual or primary source material as you can possibly make it. So we did things like really researching the particular sizes of longhouses in Long Island and the shape of the palisades that we used in the village. There's actually an archaeological drawing of a particular Long Island Indian village, I'm going to try not to drive everybody crazy here by talking and looking at this thing, but there's a particular Indian village that has exactly this shape of palisades. So we use that because the archaeology tells us that that shape actually was there. Was it there on the spot that we chose? We don't know that. And I think I made that really clear, that we were estimating where this village should be, and should we get very lucky and get some funding and be able to do that thing where they can use radar and sonar and stuff and figure it out, we would be thrilled to find that out. So when you're doing a project like this, you try very, very hard to get things to be as authentic as you possibly can. The Dutch are generally taken from, they're either cut out from Dutch 17th century paintings, or they're generated in AI and then later dressed in Dutch 17th century garb based on those paintings and our knowledge of the New Netherland clothing, and the same thing with the Native Americans.
I think that certainly can bring it much more to life than just the spoken word or text or things like that. So it certainly sounds like a very exciting new technology. In terms of the archaeology, is there active archaeological work being done on Long Island?
I don't know. I don't know. We're hoping in our next iteration of this to try to contact some archaeologists and start to bring that into the project also. And we're also hoping to make the model be even more interactive. So if, rather than just viewing a visualization, we're wishing to be able to allow you to click on a particular part of the model, and from there, deep dive into the encyclopedia should you wish to, or deep dive into one of the maps that relate to what's going on, should you wish to. The integration between the encyclopedia, the mapping, and the 3D modeling is what we're working on next.
Got it. Oh, I see a hand over here.
You speak about the men who were on the St. Maurice. How many women were there and how many children? Do you know?
We don't.
Oh, you don't?
I don't know yet. That's another area of research for us. We do know that there are women. Yes.
And it would have also been one of those things that warriors would have immediately looked for that. Because if women and children were not present, the men were, you have to remember the Peach War was a pretty devastating conflict that had occurred. And so when the men saw that there were women and children on board, they knew that no warrior, no war party brings their women and children. So any immediately thought of, okay, we're going to hit and run kind of goes away.
Hi. So I'm not sure of my geography, but Fire Island is a barrier island.
Yes.
And then across from that is a large kind of a bay. It's got a name, but I don't know it. And then there's
Great South Bay.
And then there's Islip or the land there, those towns. Mm-hmm. Is that where the village was?
The village is close to Brookhaven, right? So I'm going to grab the map for you. Sorry, give me a sec. Okay, so here's Long Island, right? Or at least Long Island as a 1656 person would have believed it to be, right? Without Fire Island. And here's the Carmans River right here, okay? Now, on the other side of this map, you can see the Google Maps of what actually does exist now. I'm going to zoom right into that area for you, okay? This area right here, there's the Carmans River, right? And we place the village right here, right off Squassix Landing, right here.
So one of the questions when I was listening to the presentation was that they did the move, I think they said in a day.
Yeah.
Well, that's people going across in those boats.
Yes.
With the 129 or so, and some of the goods. Yep. And getting them up there, that's a remarkable effort.
Yeah.
That's like George Washington crossing the Delaware.
I don't think
It's
so.
impossible, but they did.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it's quite. I think those machines really move. Number
And
one.
you have also men who are at the peak of their fitness paddling. You know,
Sure.
essentially being on a dugout canoe is essentially on a floating couch. So that's essentially how they work. But if you have a machine with 20, you know, with even 5 men in there, once you pick up speed,
It really moves.
it moves.
And also, if you think about it, you've got 80 soldiers, right? Those guys, they unloaded the entire hull of that ship in a day with one boat. So if you've got, 50 or so machines and 200 guys from the village, they're going to move all that stuff and all those people, no problem.
We even know, even far later with American whaling, that these guys would hunt whales, sperm whales, and then row back with a 100-ton whale an hour to go back to their ship to process it. And if men could, and that's only 5, 6 men in one of those boats going back to a larger ship. If they could do that, this is very much in the reason of logic, that very logical that it could occur.
I'm humbled, but I'm still glad I asked my question.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked it too, because we actually sort of struggled with it. And then we started talking with Chief Harry about whaling. And it totally changed we're like, oh, okay, now we understand. We also were like, gosh, March, it's like really cold. In some of the other Algonkian cultures, the machines are sunk for the winter to keep them wet and in good shape, right? They aren't used during the winter because it's too cold and the lakes freeze or whatever. But that's not true out here on Fire Island. Whaling season starts in September and runs through April. So these guys are using these machines all winter long. I can't even imagine the cold. I can't imagine. You're going through those breakers in January trying to do whaling. Unbelievable.
I have another question over here.
I have 2 questions. One, you had mentioned that they were taking the Dutch to South River area. Mm-hmm. What is the South River area?
That's the Delaware River. That's the mouth of the Delaware River.
Oh, so it's not Manhattan. They were
No.
Well, they did end up getting down to Manhattan. Okay, so they were headed for South River, but they originally needed to stop in Manhattan anyway. Once they got stuck in the Unkechaug village, the plan was to get them out of the village and to Manhattan and then figure out how to regroup and get everybody down to South River, because it was kind of an emergency situation.
Right. And the second question is, why did they leave on Christmas Day, where they would be sailing through the winter in the North Atlantic?
Yes. Very interesting, wonderful question, because one of Jacob Aldrich's letters back to Amsterdam says, this wasn't a good idea, and you guys should really think carefully about when you send your ships.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more. So I'll see another hand back here. I'm cold just thinking about it.
I know, right? Me too.
I just wondered if any of these boats exist anymore, anywhere?
Yes.
If you're talking about machoons and like a Kwallentan or Mahul, like canoes, yes, we have a lot of surviving ones that have been found in lakes and ponds. Obviously, you can't hop in them and go paddle around, but the objects still exist. They're in multiple museums throughout the United States. There are many tribal communities that still produce canoes. My community makes dugout canoes. The Wampanoags, Shinnecocks, all produce, and the Nipmucs all produce, and the Narragansetts produce dugout canoes, and they have that skill. So there are still people making these dugout canoes, still using dugout canoes, whether it may not be an everyday, but it's one that the skill still survives, and people still honor that tradition.
Yeah, and I honestly think that we could do a whole presentation just on machoons and machoon culture. It's so amazing. It's so amazing to think about the Hudson River or the Carmen's River, as he said, as the interstate. We have this crazy idea that Algonkian culture involved people sort of hanging around in their little village and maybe doing a little hunting here or there. and that they weren't very mobile. Absolutely not true. These guys would get in a canoe and head all the way down to Manhattan, all the way up to Albany, down to Virginia.
Yeah.
They were really mobile.
Even foot travel is 30 miles in a day. It terrified Europeans because you could have a mobile force of warriors at your doorstep in a couple of hours, because these men are running or they're paddling, And so it was one of these things, they knew they could travel 30 miles in a day, that's one town to another. That's literally from the coastal Connecticut to western Connecticut in a day.
Sure. And the Peach War itself, they landed 500 warriors in only 64 canoes.
Yeah.
So that tells you that's an average of at least 8 guys in a canoe, right? They were really, really moving. And they came in on both sides of the island and met in the middle. Just took over the island in less than an hour. Bang. Really powerful. These canoes really move.
And I'll just note too, because I know we're limited with formal question time.
Sorry.
If people have questions afterward, please feel free to come up to us and ask questions.
Yeah. Well, I think we obviously just have a lot more to learn. I think that's one of the takeaways here. And then I'm just going to end with just one last question here for you, Drew.
Sure.
So one of the things I was most struck with was Chief Harry Wallace talking about sort of the laws of the land. If you come in peace, you are entitled to come and share among us. Could you talk a little bit more about that in terms of, is that unique to the Uncochog Nation? Was that prevalent throughout many of the indigenous nations here?
That's a great question. So among Algonkian people, it was kind of where we get this sense of representational democracy. The idea of representational democracy largely comes from the Iroquoians and other eastern woodland people. What we know is that when Europeans arrive here, they arrive into an active game of chess. Native people are just as intelligent, conniving, manipulative, and power-playing as their European counterparts. And their political systems are just as complex and hierarchical. They just work differently. And so for our communities, it was one of those things that if people, exactly like you said, if people came in peace and offered us food, we would respond in kind. And all of those things would be done in kind. But the political system was incredibly complex. And you had, William Penn describes some of the council structure very well. And he describes it in a half-moon shape, that you have councils could be up to 200 people, but that you had your sachem, your chief, and his vice chief. You had behind them is the council, then behind them is the young warriors, and then the women and the children. So it's this tiered half-moon shape. And it could be 500 people that are there. And in Algonkian custom and culture, each person has a voice. Each individual has a voice. And so a lot of times Europeans write how they're so annoyed dealing with the Indians because it takes days and weeks to get them to get to a decision. What we know also from William Penn is that oftentimes chiefs would not speak. They had speakers that would, as Penn puts it, speak the king's mind. And that their job was, because orators were very important people in our communities. So orators a lot of times would be in charge of reading wampum belts and pulling out wampum belts and reading the wampum, but as well they were the most fluent in the formal language. So there was 2 different tiers of language: common language, which is informal, and formal language. And not everyone has, even in our society, has a very good command of formal language. And the orator's job is to be fluent in that formal language. And so the laws here were complex, and there were laws for if people broke things. A lot of times there's a lot of capital punishment where it's death. But there's also reciprocity. There's a lot of feasting, giving of wampum. There's also, in the case of murderers, one of the fun things about that is that, according to Vanderdonk, if someone was to murder someone, they had 24 hours to find the murderer. And if they couldn't find that individual in 24 hours, they pretty much got away scot-free till they decided to come back and either repay the damages by feasting or giving wampum, or deciding they wish to just turn themselves in because they've just had enough of living life on the lam. And this shows up multiple times in multiple documents. In 1660, during the Esopus Wars, there is a farm that burns down. The Esopus are blamed. Stuyvesant says, hey, this farm is burned down. Why did you do this? We demand you give us your murderers. And they say, it's not us. It is an Indian from Haverstraw who came up here. He was a bad Indian, and he burned all these houses, and then he left, and we couldn't find him. He was gone, and so we couldn't pursue him. And according to their law, it was past the 24-hour mark of them to be able to pursue. And so there was all these different laws and legal precedents that the Dutch and others had a very hard time understanding at points, but also took great care to understand, especially things like gift giving and reciprocity. Those were very, very important things for them to understand in order for treaties and other things to move forward with Native people.
And I think that question about was the law of the land of sharing or helping someone who was in need, I have heard of many examples of that occurring. So I do think it's probably not just Unkechaug. And clearly, Harry says that, the council would have called in people from surrounding tribes to have this conversation.
This was a very fast decision. This is a decision that could have taken days in a regular term, or days or even a week.
Right. As it was, 3 days is a long time for these people to be out there in the cold, right? But it's relatively quick for a council.
We know from, like I said, in documents in the 18th century that some of these councils took weeks to make a decision. So that the decision was made in 3 to 4 days is very, very fast.
Well, it's such a fascinating story. I think we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you guys so much. Can we have a round of applause for Drew and Toya?
Thank you.
So we're here to answer some questions for you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Let's start with the first question. We've got a few interesting questions. This one is probably best answered by Drew. What do we know about their ability to communicate with each other? Were there some people who could translate by this time?
Yes. So by the 1650s, we know that there are multiple Europeans that are learning indigenous dialects, indigenous languages, and are able to communicate with Native people. Sometimes it's very fluent, sometimes it's broken. We know, for instance, the account of Henry Norwood, where he talks about an Indian trader who speaks broken Indian, and this guy, his job was to trade with Native people. So if that's his fluency rate, it went from very good to not so great.
Right. And also what we know about specifically the area around Long Island is that they were trading with New Amsterdam very regularly, and that Sarah Kierstead, who was such a great translator down there, was probably working with them. And so there probably were plenty of people in that village who had at least some broken Dutch, let's put it that way.
Right.
Or some ability to communicate, right?
Right.
Yeah. Lovely. Okay, our next question is, tell us a little bit about the Palisades and why they were square rather than round.
All I was going to add was that originally we were going to do round,
Yes.
because that's what most 17th century maps show, are these round intersecting palisades, and they intersect at two sections, front and back. And there's like two entrances. This was influenced by archaeology that was very specific to that area of Long Island.
Yes, absolutely. And that was a really interesting find for both of us, right? Because both of us were prepared to do this round palisade, and it was very interesting to find that there are multiple locations on Long Island that have this sort of scround, sort of squarish shape.
Right.
That
I would also add that some of the thickness of it is based off of the model at the New York State Museum. So we were influenced by that, as opposed to if you go to Mashantucket Pequot and it's very large poles that are in the ground. This one is kind of this thatchy kind of the way we created it.
Yes, and wonderfully, Chelsea Teal provided us with all kinds of great photographs of that we were able to actually use as the textures in the 3D model. So that was really great. So another question, how do you know that aid was requested from neighboring indigenous villages? Well, we don't know, right? We don't know for sure. This is partially an assumption. The idea originally came from a discussion with Chief Harry of the Unkachag Nation. And I think it had to do with, sheer strategy and numbers. After they saw so many people in the boat, they thought, well, we want to make sure we have enough people in our village to handle the situation. And that's a logical thing.
Right. And your average village is between 50 and 200 people. So even then, say this village was small, say it was between 50 to 60 people, they might have needed extra people to come and help.
Yeah, to handle 129 people, for sure.
Right.
Yes. And of course, I'm sure those villages were in contact with one another regularly anyway. A next question is, Chief Harry talks about Manhattan as a place of trade. Does he refer to the fur trade with the Dutch West India Company there?
I'm not sure. I think he means it's a place of trade not only because of the Dutch fort that's there. I think it was also a place of trade prior to contact, just because it's a peninsula, and peninsulas are, and it's not a great distance by water. It's very navigable. So I think he was implying that even prior to the Dutch, it was always a place of trade. And you're also at a bi-state, you're between New Jersey and New York. So you can get things that are coming up from, say, the Maryland coast through the Jersey coast, all the way through to the North Jersey, and you can get them there. So, I mean, it's a natural place of trade.
It is a natural place of trade also, and I think specifically for the Unkachag and Shinnecock and Long Island tribes who for whom whaling was a tradition. They were whaling and had something to trade in the wintertime. They were very confident in those amazing machoons in the wintertime. And of course, Manhattan has a harbor that never freezes. So I think he's talking about that long before the Europeans arrived, a whole lot of trade was going on in Manhattan. And I think that's a really interesting idea to explore in future discussions. Okay, let's make sure I'm just, okay, we've got another question. Is it known if the inlet, now known as Old Inlet, was navigable at the time in order for the rescue ships and native craft to travel to and from the ocean and Carmans River? I can't tell you that I know what Old Inlet is specifically. I'm sorry, but we'll happily research that a little bit. What we did hear from Chief Harry and about that area is that this was a group of people who began navigating for whaling in September, and the whaling season opened at the end of September and continued right on through the end of March. So even in the depths of winter, this was a culture that was finding ways to navigate in that time.
I would also add as well that we do know that sea level has risen just over time. So even, my community's in Maryland. So, I mean, I've had people tell me, my community, they said, when John Smith came here, the water was actually like 5 feet lower than where it is now. It's actually 5 feet higher from what Smith saw. So if that's possible, I mean, it could be that in the 1650s, the water level was different. I really don't know. I don't know if we'll ever really truly know.
Sure. Yes, that's a really important point to make. This is an interpretation. We are using Jacob Aldrich's letters and our interviews with Chief Harry and some other research to piece together what may well have happened. It's possible, and this is obviously a first iteration of the 3D model of the Unkachag village and the shipwreck and the area around there. It's possible that as we continue to research that we'll find out new things, decide that some of what we decided to interpret this way was incorrect and change it. We'll hope to find out more. Another question, did the mayors of Amsterdam realize any monetary rewards for their investment via the ships? Oh, gosh, that's a toughie. I'm not sure. I think over time, the Delaware South River settlement failed. So in the long run, I don't think that they were very happy about how things went. But in the short run, they may have gotten a couple of great shipments out of there and so forth, but it eventually did fail. Let's see. Another question. What research indicates that the governance structures of the Native Americans became part of the U.S. governance structure?
That's another great question. That's a great question. So in the 1770s, Ben Franklin alludes to, because he spends a lot of time with the Six Nations in the 1750s during the French and Indian War. He was very impressed by their forms of governance. And you can read Haudenosaunee law, and you can read books on their governance, and it's representative democracy, essentially. It's, you know, has different representations from each council. And Franklin was very, very impressed, and he writes this letter that says, you know, if, you know, that the Indians have this great system of governance, and that, you know, if we did something similar, it would be to our benefit. And I'm paraphrasing. That's not his exact wording. But many other Europeans besides Franklin, Conrad Weiser is another one who spends a lot of time with Native people. And they all write, a lot of Europeans write about how this government works. And they're all very impressed by it. They're fascinated that it's so organized, particularly the Six Nations. They are fascinated with how organized it is. So it is undoubtedly that they would have been, you know, impressed by it, and it would have made an impact when they were forming our government.
Yeah, interesting. Another question, as a result of this rescue, was this indigenous village and people safe and treated with respect during the later fighting throughout the region? I doubt very much that this particular village was treated differently than any of the other villages in the area, sadly. There may have been, we'll have to do some more research on that, but I doubt very much that it would have changed things in a big way,
right?
Sadly.
Right.
Is there any record of the Dutch recognizing the generosity of the indigenous people? Any rewards? Well, no, we haven't found any record of that in our research yet. I think rewards, they obviously had some level of trading going on, but I don't think that it was a significant reward in comparison to what they offered the Europeans in terms of saving them. They would have died on that beach. I think it's obvious to me after 3 days and 3 nights with no fire and no heat and no way of getting off Fire Island by themselves other than a single boat that was so small it would have taken them, and they really didn't know where they were. I think by the time, without that help of the indigenous people, I don't think they would have made it. I think there's one more question, and Drew, I'll let you answer this one because this is a funny one. Why did they decide to leave on Christmas Day?
I think it's because of the winds. I think that's the whole, you have to remember, sailing is an art. Like, it's a whole science and art, and you have to keep in mind where the winds are going, what the sea is doing. And so when people left Europe to come here, they left at certain times because they knew it would take them several months, and they wanted to encounter certain winds and certain favorable aspects of the sea. So if they knew if they left on Christmas Day, they would get there by like June 2nd or something, and that would be more favorable weather for them to get to the New World.
Yeah, and I think you know, Jacob Aldrich writes back to Amsterdam to say, you know, we might consider leaving a little later so that we arrive in a warmer time. This was really hard. So I don't know whether they, you know, they were probably sort of in a crashing rush to have the settlement at the South River occupied. And also you're right about the trade winds happening at that time. It's just, it's miserably cold. I can't imagine 2 months in that weather on board a ship like that. So how many of the passengers or soldiers' names are known? We do know some of them, not all of them, and hopefully we will uncover more research that answers that question in greater detail. Please don't hesitate to take a look at our listing of the ship journeys in our encyclopedia, and you'll see listed there what we do have. And many of those are actually linked to specific biographies of the people themselves. And in some cases, we even know their children and their jobs and all kinds of interesting things. So, okay, we have one more comment. I don't believe the South River settlements were failures. New Amstel is now Newcastle, Delaware. Yes, that's true. That's true. There were aspects of the settlement that did fail, but in the end, people did manage to survive, and they did manage to settle there, and we do have a lovely place there now.
Yeah, I would kind of add also, it's compared to, say, New York City or Beverwijk, you know, which is Fort Orange. You know, the South River is always kind of a backwater, like it's always a back settlement. It's never like the prime locus for anything. I mean, you can even read C.A. Westlager, and he talks about, you know, Newcastle being like the heart of the liquor trade going into Maryland and other places. And like they had a lot of problems with Native Americans and alcohol in around this period.
Yes. Yes. So, okay, I don't see any more questions. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone for joining us this evening, and so many thanks to Drew for working with us on this project, and also to Chief Harry Wallace and Dr. Charles Gearing and Dr. Chelsea Teal and all the other wonderful people who helped make this possible. This recording will be live on our website under past events sometime within the next week. And I know that we'll also be sending a link to everyone who registered. So if you missed part of it or would like to go back and listen to another part of it or share it with a friend, we'd be grateful for that. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We're grateful that you joined us.